Welcome to an episode of the Sri Lankan Understanding, and I'm Shanuki Dialvis. I'm here at our location partner, the Mount Lavinia Hotel, and today we'd like to focus on a conversation that explores women's histories in the process and in the context of transitional justice, accountability, and memorialization. And to have this discussion with me, I have Radhika Hettiarachchi, who was at first a little hesitant to come on the show until I convinced her that she has to be here because she's the perfect expert opinion to have on this conversation. And what I'd like to talk about is, in Sri Lanka's post-conflict history, what is the story of women? Where have women contributed? Where have women required healing? And what is the progress or lack thereof of transitional justice and accountability for women who have experienced Sri Lanka's conflict history? So thank you very much for being here with us. Radhika is a public historian, she's a researcher, she's documented women's stories, especially with your exhibitions and projects called the Her Stories Project and Women's Histories in Sex Work. And so I'm hoping this will be a really interesting and eye-opening conversation to have for those of you who are out there who have not been exposed to the work that's going on or to the stories that, you know, have built Sri Lanka's present, so to speak. So thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So just for everybody's understanding, including mine, because I'm not from the field that you are, transitional justice is this field of exploring how the legacies of human rights abuses and human traumas have been addressed, and what is it that countries have done or need to do to ensure that every victim of whether it's crisis or war has the necessary access to justice, accountability, and healing to get over the experiences. So for women, especially for women, in Sri Lanka, we have had a disproportionate impact because I think although conflict and post-conflict victimization is a mainstream sort of topic in the media, a lot of the time the voices of women and the experiences of women in particular sometimes are silenced. So can you tell me a little bit about that? I'd like to know sort of, so Sri Lanka has had truth commissions, various truth commissions or various forms of truth commissions over the years. Radhika, despite numerous truth commissions and the promises of reparations, especially in the post-conflict scenarios, women's experiences and narratives have often been sidelined. Why do you think this is?
I think to answer that question about why and how women's voices or experiences have been sidelined in war narratives and indeed justice processes, I think we have to come back a little bit and talk about the structural and systemic context within which they sit. Systemic challenges like, for example, within the public sector infrastructure or grievance mechanisms, there are systemic biases that exist. And these over time have always sort of prioritized different voices and sidelined women's needs and women's voices. And gender-specific marginalization in this way doesn't always exist in isolation. Mm-hmm. It exists intersected with many other factors like ethnicity, religion, where people come from, where they live, socioeconomic status, and the politics of the space that has an impact on the social construction of what it means to be a woman. And if I were to digress a little bit, or actually maybe even, you know, it's very pertinent. This is a kind of structural patriarchy that infuses all aspects of our social lives, and it normalizes being left behind, self-sacrifice, self-erasure as idealized womanhood. So over generations we've internalized this, so we kind of accept that, you know, we will be less visible And that's a problem. And that is one of the things that actually underline your question about why women's voices are sidelined in war narratives and in transitional justice processes. So if you were to specifically talk about that, and we need to also talk about how the war played out and how the war ended in Sri Lanka. So particularly if you think about after the end of the war and the nation building narratives that were built up, they're through a very masculine lens. So even if women's experiences are at least proportionately affected in terms of displacement and camp life and loss of loved ones and taking on the role of breadwinners after the war, they are less visible because of the kind of narrativization that prioritizes this masculine lens. So this kind of selective narrativization, it prioritizes a victor's perspective, and this is not uncommon with any war, where the victor's voices are the loudest voices because the other side is, or the other perspective is vanquished or absent in a lot of senses. This kind of selective narrativization comes at the cost of reckoning with our past, with our difficult past. And women's histories sit within this very specific space. So women's histories and experiences inhabit this very specific and peculiar space, and they're affected by all of this post-war narrativization as well as the structural patriarchy that we were talking about. It's interesting because they're simultaneously present and absent. So as you said, truth commissions, for example, women came out in droves to tell their stories. They talked about their loved ones that were missing, the enforced disappearances, and women have been very active in memory activism, Mothers Front, for example, throughout the war, and all of that continues to this day, and it's a very powerful voice. But there's stories of grief, there's stories of loss, and all grief is valid. It is important that it is actually present in the public sphere. But there is grief and loss that is sanctioned, and grief and loss that is silenced because of everything we talked about, right? And so the kind of grief that is silenced, either by design or because of the structural contextual issues, end up being about the violence that women have actually experienced in their lives and their stories of survival. So these stories of sexual violence, for example, don't sit neatly within this idealized womanhood or idealized motherhood, that talk about their sons or daughters that were disappeared. They don't sit within that field. And so as a result, those women's experiences of sexual violence and the psychological impact and their stories of survival and rebuilding their lives after, they get lost in this narrative. And if they're not on the table, then they cannot be addressed.
Thank you for that understanding, that overview. And I'm really looking forward to finding out about a particular group of women who have been sort of historically silenced and are marginalized a lot more than others. So we're going to talk about that when we come back from the commercial break. Welcome back to the Sri Lankan Understanding, and in our last segment we talked about the fact that women's voices have historically been sidelined and their narratives have remained unheard in the post-war context of transitional justice and accountability. But now I want to speak particularly about Radhika's special projects, where you have documented the stories of sex workers in these situations. And sex workers are by far the most marginalized group of women, and their voices have continuously gone unheard, and they are the most vulnerable group as well, because like you said, they don't fall into the category of what is romanticized and glamorized as a woman deserving of justice, for instance, or healing for that matter. Can you tell me what are the unique sort of experiences and stigmas and abuses that these women have experienced?
Becoming a sex worker is a result of many factors, particularly during the war. Displacement, disrupted education, loss of a loved one or a breadwinner makes some women choose sex work, and it's a survival choice. And here I'm not discounting the fact that there was trafficking and there was sexual exploitation, because they existed. But the work I've been doing is particularly with women who have chosen to be sex workers during the conflict. And we can have a conversation about the structural violence of that choice, but that's a separate conversation. But as a survival choice, this is a lucrative income for a lot of women. And it allows the kind of flexibility that lets a woman be a caregiver and a mother and a wife, and look after their families, while also being able to earn maybe twice, maybe 3 times more than they would earn if they worked full day, and at the cost of having to sacrifice their caregiving or other roles. So a lot of these sex workers are also mothers. So, you know, just like what we talked about earlier, where motherhood is a central choice for a lot of people to be involved in this, motherhood is in a lot of ways a choice for women to take on sex work during the war. So in general, when a woman becomes a sex worker, they battle social stigma because of society's myopic sort of vision of what morality is and what it means to be a woman. So beyond the social stigma that you know, society ascribes to women of being a mother or a wife or a caregiver in a very specific way, they also have to battle the legal environment within which they work. And so
what legal environment, though, in Sri Lanka for someone?
I mean, well, the legal environment uses existing laws arbitrarily to arrest them. Even though in the recent past, several magistrate court decisions have said that sex work or being a sex worker per se isn't illegal. So they operate in a rather ambiguous legal environment that uses laws in a punitive way. And beyond this, there's also the physical dangers of being a sex worker, whether it's client violence or whether it is when they go to try and report something like this to the police and being dismissed, or the violence they encounter at those institutions, which is the kind of structural violence we talked about. And so all of these factors affect them in general, but during conflict, there is a transactional agreement or a transactional contract between 2 consenting parties to perform a sexual act. But this contract happens in a situation of distorted or highly unequal power balances, whether it's between civilians, men or women, or civilians and militarized groups. So whatever this unequal space is, it disproportionately affects the woman who's a sex worker. Now, conflict-related sexual violence, I mean, there's a UN definition for all of this. But what makes this unique is that it extends this definition of conflict-related sexual violence because this happens in a situation of a contract. So it's easy to dismiss.
So I'm really interested in just having this conversation of them accepting that violence is okay. What is that about, and how do we find accountability for them in that sense?
So sexual violence on the job is something they think is acceptable, or rather something they have to live with through sheer courage. So they actually negotiate in their minds or in their daily lives about what kind of violence is acceptable and what is not. And often they think they kind of couch it in comfort language that, they come to us with frustrations or things they don't get, so we provide a care service, So for women during conflict, I mean, there are several types of experiences. For example, so in conflict zones particularly, where when they have a deal, which is what is called, taking on a client, they would go into an abandoned house or a security hut or the jungle, and they would have this transactional agreement with one person, but 3 or 4 turn up. Now that is gang rape. But it goes unaccounted for. Sometimes, sex work always involved travel into conflict zones, outside, into conflict adjacent areas. And when you're traveling, you're obviously passing checkpoints. And to get through safely, sometimes they offer a sexual favor. Now that's sexual bribery. Or sometimes women get taken away into an abandoned house or something, and for days on end they're kept and then several men have used them, and then they are let go. That would be that's kidnapping and sexual slavery in some ways. And then within camps, for example, when women have been raped, they realize that they can bargain sex for clean water, for being in the line a little bit ahead, or milk powder for their children, or biscuits or food. And that sexual bargaining is exploitation. So all of these different elements account for the fact that these are harsh realities of sexual violence that they can only manage or think about what is acceptable and what is not for them. And in the context of transitional justice and accountability processes, this kind of sexual violence on sex workers is rarely heard and rarely included, which is why projects like Women's Histories of Sex Work matter and they amplify the voice.
We will talk about that, and I'd like to talk about that project in particular and why and what other work you've been doing around this. We will be back after a commercial break. Welcome back to the final segment of today's episode. And I know I might sound like, every person who doesn't understand this experience as deeply as you do because you have been working in these spaces, but it has been heartbreaking for me to hear that these are the histories that women, these untold histories that women kind of share, and this burden that they carry is the stories of sex workers, is that the only documentation you have done in terms of like post-conflict access to justice and healing?
So the Women's Histories of Sex Work sits within a larger project called the Her Stories Project, and there's another project called the Memory Map Archive. These are all projects that document women's experiences of conflict. And the thing is that they document life histories. So it's not just about an enforced disappearance or something, or about loss of property or something like that. They're larger life histories of what their lives are like before, what they've endured because of conflict, and what they have, and their survival, their courage and their ability to survive, and what more they need from us, their society, in terms of understanding.
Thanks. And as you very rightly said, that these stories need to be told, it is documentation like this that's why this is so important and so valuable, because the formal systems don't capture these stories, and they're very important stories that create the foundation of where we need to go. So if I were to ask you, Radhika, like because the formal system, shall we say, for a lack of better words, is not as supportive as we'd like, especially with certain marginalized groups of women. So if you can tell me what kind of work is being done outside the formal system by grassroots initiatives or community-based groups to create new pathways of seeking justice and seeking healing for women whose experiences are really not being heard enough?
I think for people or for women who've experienced this kind of loss and this kind of suffering, healing is not an end date. It's a long-term, perhaps lifelong process. So for women, particularly who've been through the mill in terms of accountability, seeking accountability and justice, and have seen the existing mechanisms not deliver that adequately, and with every year that we every year we move ahead, it becomes even more distant. And they still continue. If you think about women's groups, mothers groups, they still continue to seek this kind of accountability and justice, but it doesn't necessarily mean healing. And for a lot of women, this means that they've actually chosen to create opportunities for themselves in terms of association forming, in terms of movement building, so that their shared experiences and shared stories can strengthen and amplify their voice. So, for example, for sex workers who have experienced a conflict-related sexual violence, there are reasons why they can't or they don't come forward.
Yeah.
Partially because sexual violence against them is something that is unseen and unwitnessed. So to come forward with it, it's very difficult within this existing sort of framing, moral framing of their work. Secondly, they don't have faith in the justice system, because not just because of the culture of a lack of accountability that is pervasive in this country, but it's also because they have experience going to the police and being dismissed, for example. So there is no faith in the justice systems. And thirdly, frankly, I guess accountability sits lower in their hierarchy of needs. For them, it's about providing for their children and their families, securing their own financial future as they age out of sex work, or managing their safety. So for them, it sits lower.
Yeah.
In this sense, what sex workers do, as women have done throughout, is to build these connections and networks, and if not healing, at least in the sisterhood and their connection with allies, there is some comfort, and hopefully there will be accountability, because they keep fighting and they keep asking for it.
Okay. Thank you for taking the time to come and talk me through these experiences. I think I've been sort of exposed to your exhibition in the past, and I found it very powerful, very moving. And you will be taking these stories into the future, right? You'll be sort of exhibiting them elsewhere. And I do hope that these are conversations that people will start to have, and these are stories that people will start to explore more in depth and not sort of shy away from, because we do tend to be very uncomfortable with things like this, but they are so important. When we talk about history, I mean, sometimes, yes, history deserves celebration and there are lots of legacies that we must be proud of, but when it comes to women's histories, there is a lot of work still to be done. And as much as there are women who have created history in Sri Lanka, there are women who historically have been sidelined and who need to be heard, because if we are to move forward and progress as a country beyond this legacy of war and devastation and victimization, we must learn this other side of history as well and come together to converse and have discourse on how can we move forward, how can we better ourselves, how can we ensure that no woman is left behind. So thank you very much, Radhika, for being a part of this, and thank you for engaging with this episode, and thank you to the Mount Lavinia Hotel for being our location partner, and we will see you next time with a new episode on women's histories in the Sri Lankan understanding.